Why did millions of American men lock themselves inside a small concrete room attached to their own house every single weekend, covered in oil, breathing gasoline fumes, building machines fast enough to kill them? In 1950, the American garage was not just a place to park a car. It was a battlefield for identity, a birthplace of an entire youth culture, and in some neighborhoods, a private fortress built to survive the end of the world. This is the strange, loud, and dangerous story of garage culture in 1950s America. After World War II ended, millions of veterans returned home to a booming economy, cheap suburban housing, and an explosion of new tract developments across the country. Builders like William Levitt turned farmland into instant neighborhoods, with Levittown in New York becoming the most famous example of mass-produced post-war housing. These new homes came with something earlier, generations rarely owned, a private garage attached directly to the house. On paper, it was built to shelter the family automobile. In practice, it quickly became something far more personal, a workshop where men and teenage boys could disappear for hours away from wives, mothers, and the polished expectations of suburban life. Behind that closed door, a man could be messy, loud, and completely in control of something mechanical, at a time when so much of post-war life felt scripted and uniform. That private space collided with a wave of cheap, war surplus machinery and a booming used car market, and the result was the hot rod. Young men, many of them former mechanics or pilots from the war, began buying up old Ford Model A and Model T bodies for almost nothing, stripping them down and rebuilding them for speed rather than comfort. Fenders were removed to cut weight. Bumpers disappeared. Engines were swapped, bored out, and modified using parts scavenged from junkyards and surplus stores. This was not a hobby with instruction manuals. It was trial and error, learned by hand, often taught by fathers, older brothers, or complete strangers who shared the same obsession. The center of this obsession was California, specifically the dry lake beds northeast of Los Angeles, places like El Mirage and Muroc, where the flat, hard clay surface stretched for miles and offered a natural, if brutal, racetrack. As early as the 1930s, small clubs of speed enthusiasts had begun timing their homemade cars across these lake beds, and by the post-war years this had grown into an organized, if unofficial, sport. Clubs banded together to form the Southern California Timing Association, which set rules and record books for how fast a home-built car could legally be verified to go. Suddenly, the garage was not just a place to build a car. It was the training ground for a competitive underground sport with its own culture, slang, and heroes. Beyond the dry lakes, the ultimate proving ground for a garage-built machine was the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, a vast, blindingly white expanse of hardened salt that offered miles of flat, straight surface unlike anything else in the country. Starting in 1949, the Southern California Timing Association organized an annual event known as Speed Week, where home-built cars from small-town garages lined up alongside more polished factory-backed machines to chase official land speed records. A man who had spent months alone in his garage, hand-fitting an engine he barely understood on paper, could suddenly find his name and his top speed printed in a national record book, an almost unimaginable form of recognition for someone who, on any other day of the week, worked as a plumber, a machinist, or a store clerk. The engine that powered most of this obsession was the Ford Flathead V8, first introduced in 1932 and still widely available and affordable 2 decades later. Backyard mechanics learned to modify its cylinder heads, add multiple carburetors, and shave weight from every possible component, squeezing horsepower out of an engine design that Ford itself had never intended for racing. Magazines like Hot Rod, launched in 1948 by publisher Robert Peterson, turned this scattered garage tinkering into a national movement, printing photographs of stripped-down roadsters and detailed how-to guides that let a teenager in Ohio learn the same tricks being developed in a garage in Pasadena. But this culture had a genuinely dangerous, even deadly, side. Away from the dry lakes, impatient teenagers and young men began racing their modified cars on public streets, often late at night, on straight stretches of road near their own neighborhoods. These illegal street races caused a rising number of accidents, injuries, and deaths throughout the late 1940s and into the following decade, alarming parents, police departments, and city officials who saw garages not as harmless hobby spaces but as breeding grounds for reckless, high-speed danger. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching this from. In response to the mounting death toll from illegal street racing, a former hot rod journalist named Wally Parks founded the National Hot Rod Association in 1951. His goal was straightforward: give young drivers a legal, supervised place to race in a straight line, away from public streets and pedestrians. The organisation worked with local police departments and abandoned military airstrips to create sanctioned drag strips, and within a few years, organised quarter-mile drag racing had become a nationwide sport, drawing thousands of spectators and pulling much of the danger, though never all of it, off residential streets and into a controlled environment. As drag racing became more organised, the cars built in these home garages also began appearing at large public exhibitions rather than just on airstrips and salt flats. The Oakland Roadster Show, first held in 1950, gave amateur builders a chance to display their creations indoors, under lights, judged against one another for craftsmanship rather than raw speed. Winning the show's top prize, later known as America's Most Beautiful Roadster, could transform a builder from an anonymous weekend tinkerer into a recognized name within the small but passionate national hot rod community, and photographs of winning cars circulated through magazines for months afterward, inspiring countless imitators working in garages who would never attend the show themselves. While drag racing gave garage culture its speed, another movement gave it its style. In Los Angeles, brothers George and Sam Barris opened a custom car shop that would come to define what enthusiasts called custom culture. Rather than focus purely on speed, customizers reshaped the body of a car entirely, chopping the roofline lower, shaving off door handles and hood ornaments for a smoother silhouette, lowering the suspension so the car appeared to hug the ground, and adding elaborate paintwork that no factory would ever have approved. George Barris in particular became known across the country as the man who could turn an ordinary Mercury or Ford into a rolling sculpture, and his shop's designs were copied by amateur builders working in garages from coast to coast. No custom car of the era was complete without pinstriping, and the artist most associated with the trend was Kenneth Howard, known professionally as Von Dutch. Working out of a converted garage himself, Von Dutch developed a fast, freehand striping style using thin lines of paint that seemed to defy the rigid geometry of the car beneath them, along with a signature flying eyeball design that became one of the most bootlegged images in American pop culture. His technique, along with flame paint jobs and metal flake finishes pioneered by other backyard artists, turned the family garage into an unlikely art studio where amateur painters practiced for hours trying to replicate a single perfect line. Almost all of this activity was dominated by men and teenage boys, and the garage itself functioned as a kind of unofficial clubhouse from which women were largely excluded, both by social custom and by the assumption, common at the time, that mechanical work simply was not a woman's domain. There were exceptions. A small number of women raced competitively at the dry lakes and later at sanctioned drag strips, and some clubs, including the San Diego-based group known as the Bean Bandits, welcomed a more diverse mix of members than the stereotype of the era suggests. Even so, these women and minority builders remained a clear minority within a culture that, in most neighborhoods, treated the garage door as an unspoken boundary line between a male world of engines and grease and the domestic world of the house just a few feet away. All of this activity, the noise, the exhaust fumes, the crowds of teenagers gathering outside garages to watch a new engine get fired up for the first time, fed directly into a growing national panic about juvenile delinquency. Parents and newspaper columnists increasingly viewed hot rodders as reckless, undisciplined, and dangerous, a symbol of a generation slipping away from adult control. Hollywood capitalized on this fear almost immediately, releasing a wave of low-budget films with titles like Hot Rod Girl and Drag Strip Girl, which portrayed teenage car culture as a gateway to rebellion and disaster, even as the same films quietly glamorized the very cars they claimed to condemn. Local governments in several states debated ordinances restricting engine modifications, and some communities banned teenagers from gathering near known hot rod garages after dark, treating the family garage as a genuine site of social anxiety rather than harmless tinkering. The concern reached all the way to Washington, where a Senate subcommittee investigating juvenile delinquency in the mid-1950s heard testimony linking reckless youth behavior to fast cars, comic books, and a general breakdown of parental authority, even though most researchers at the time struggled to prove that owning a hot rod actually made a teenager more likely to break the law. For many working-class families, the truth was closer to the opposite. A boy absorbed in rebuilding a carburetor for 6 hours on a Saturday was a boy who was, for those 6 hours at least, not out looking for other kinds of trouble. At the very same time that garages were producing hot rods and moral panic, A completely different fear was quietly reshaping how some families used that same space. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, and by the mid-1950s, the federal government's civil defense program was actively encouraging American families to prepare for the possibility of nuclear attack. While large underground fallout shelters became more common in the following decade, many 1950s families took smaller, cheaper steps within the space they already owned, reinforcing garage walls, stockpiling canned food and water along garage shelving, and in some cases converting an attached garage into a makeshift storm and fallout shelter using sandbags, concrete blocks, or surplus military supplies. The same private space where a teenager built a race car by night could, in the same week, double as his family's designated shelter in case of a bombing. A strange and rarely discussed overlap between two very different 1950s obsessions, speed and survival. Civil defense pamphlets distributed to schools and households during this period, along with short instructional films teaching children to duck and cover under their desks, reinforced the idea that safety could be achieved through simple, practical preparation, the same do-it-yourself mindset that governed how a father approached rebuilding a transmission. In this sense, the fallout shelter and the hot rod were strange cousins, both born from a very American belief that any threat, whether a rival racer at the drag strip or a nuclear-armed adversary overseas, could be met head-on with enough hands-on effort in a garage. The garage's transformation into a semi-public space also gave rise to a distinctly American commercial ritual, the garage sale. As post-war suburban families accumulated more consumer goods than any previous generation in American history, driven by rising wages and easy credit, garages filled with surplus furniture, appliances, and household items that no longer fit the family's needs. Selling these items directly from the open garage door, rather than through a formal second-hand shop, became an increasingly common practice in suburban neighborhoods through the 1950s, laying the groundwork for what would later become a nationwide weekend tradition. It was consumer culture and DIY culture meeting at the exact same doorway. Not every garage in 1950s America echoed with the sound of an engine. For a different kind of tinkerer, the same private space became a laboratory for electronics and, later in the decade, amateur rocketry. Ham radio operators built and tuned their own transmitters in garage workbenches, teaching themselves electrical theory through hobbyist manuals and swapping tips with strangers over the airwaves. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, a wave of anxious excitement about science and engineering swept through American schools and homes, and garages across the country briefly filled with boys building crude model rockets and telescopes, encouraged by parents and teachers who suddenly viewed garage tinkering not as a distraction but as a patriotic head start on a career in the coming space race. Beyond cars, paint, and canned food, the garage carried one more layer of cultural weight during this decade. The idea that it was a place where ordinary Americans could build something extraordinary with their own hands. The founding of Hewlett-Packard in a small Palo Alto garage back in 1939 was already being retold by the 1950s as a kind of only in America success story, reinforcing a growing belief that the garage was not just a workshop but a launching pad, a place where an ordinary citizen with enough persistence could tinker their way into something remarkable, whether that meant a faster car, a better business, or simply an escape from the pressures of conformity that defined so much of suburban post-war life. By the end of the 1950s, what had started as a simple parking space attached to a tract house had become one of the strangest, most layered cultural spaces in America. It was a racetrack in miniature, an art studio, a civil defense outpost, a marketplace, and a symbol of teenage rebellion, all packed into the same 300 square feet of concrete and motor oil. The roar of a modified flathead V8 echoing down a quiet suburban street at midnight was, in its own strange way, the sound of a whole generation working out who they were, one stripped down, hand-built, dangerously fast car at a time. Decades later, the influence of that single decade is still visible every time a modified car rolls down a boulevard, every time a family sets up folding tables for a weekend sale, and every time someone points to a garage and calls it the birthplace of an idea. Proof that one of the strangest chapters in American culture was written not in a factory or a boardroom, but behind an ordinary garage door.